I'm super passionate about this when people are building content architectures, because I see it skipped all the time. People build their content models, they throw in their fields, they throw in their relationships, and they kind of forget about the validation side of things. And, this can make or break your content model. Because if you don't have the right content in there, if it's not the right formats and things like that, it's not going to render out properly wherever you use it, and you won't be able to use it effectively. So if you're expecting a number and you put in text, that could break wherever that shows up. So the top most important validation thing is required fields. So handling blank values. So these kind of go hand in hand. When you're building your content, you decide what is required, and you really should understand that from a content perspective, not from where it's going. So don't think about your website is a title required on this paragraph or this page in text. Think about, if I'm looking at this content as a content object, does it make any sense if it doesn't have a title? Does it make any sense if it doesn't have a date? It has to be looked at from the content perspective, because it might not always be used in that one place for a website or whatnot. It may be used in other areas, and does it always need that piece of content? And then if it's not required, the second part here is handling the blank values. So when your developers build their solutions, pull this content, what do they do if the content doesn't exist? It's super, super important that there's communication here. And talk about this a little bit at the end here, but they should assume that some of this content may come back blank. Next things, minimum and maximum length, or just like an exact length. So when you look at taking paragraphs of content, when even dates or with time, that's a longer field than something else. What is actual minimum and maximum lengths of fields? What are those restrictions that you want on those things? And that could be length or value. If it's a number field and it's 0 to 10, it has to be within those numbers. That's really critical, because that could break however that's used on the other side. The next one will be images. Enforcing restrictions on images. I see this all the time. People will have, they're building a content model that for right now is just used on a website, and they have maybe a blog hero image, and it's 600 by 800 or 400 by 800, and they build a CMS with the ratio of, not even a ratio, they just say, give me an image, upload an image of 600 to 800. And that sounds great, but that is looking at a design first approach, not a content first approach, which means now if you want to reuse that image in other areas and it needs a different ratio or it needs a different resolution, you don't have it. You're kind of messed up there. So what you want to do is be able to upload the highest quality image you can and let the system render that down to an optimized version and a different image size or quality for each channel or each destination it goes to. And generally, it's nice to keep the ratio the same so you're not messing around too much with the image. But now with focal point focuses and different things like that, you can actually have a crop in different areas and do it properly so that you can actually get an image that's 1,000 by 1,000 can go down to 200 by 800 if you have all those things kind of set up right. So having the right ratios or understanding what size you want as that image, the file types or optimization, those need to be kind of built in and considered on your images. And the last one is you don't have to worry about people messing up uploading a 5 gigabyte image or something crazy if your system is always built to optimize and set that up. So you want to enforce validation, but also optimization with images that's automatically kind of built into the process. Consider linked content validation. So what happens when there is no linked content? I kind of talked about this in the last slide. First off, a lot of validation, a lot of linked content or related content in content management content platforms, they are soft. They link over to content, but if that content doesn't exist, it just doesn't exist, or there's nothing in that list. And so you really need to consider how important the model of your content and that piece of content is if it doesn't have that sub-content. A good example could be a blog post with categories. If it is not related to any categories, does that blog post make sense? It still could. You don't have to categorize a blog post, But if you've designed all your sources to pull by category, then that blog post will never be pulled. It will never be used anywhere. And then there's other times where you have things like products or other things where maybe they have sizes or inventory type things that are related. And without that relationship, it just doesn't make sense. So you really have to make sure that you're doing validation across content as well. And this can be difficult in some systems that don't allow that. So in our system, we have events on Save and on Publish where you can do validation across content, related content, different things like that. Some systems you can't do that. You can't catch that event and be able to get in there. So you have to change your model to support that and make sure your model validates that in different ways by having those fields directly within your content, doing custom fields, doing other ways that you can get around that. But this is an important one. I see this all the time. People publish their blog post or the products and it doesn't show up somewhere and they're like, why is it not showing up? Oh, I don't have the sub content or the link content. No, that's not filled out. And there's nothing warning them. There's no way to kind of debug that very easily. You can get very frustrated. So this is a very, very common one. This takes a little bit more thought process about covering that catches people all the time on the usability side. Ella, I see you wrote into that you had a stream issue. Hopefully, we're using Vimeo for this. Hopefully it's not cutting people out. We're going to keep going. We're recording this. We'll send the recording out if you missed some parts. And there'll be an article as well that dives into these things. So hopefully nobody else is getting kicked off. Formatting and data type validation. So for example, if you have a field that takes in email addresses, you need to validate for an email address because you may be triggering an email from your content or maybe doing other things with that content that just won't work if it's not the right format. Same with dates and times. I talked about that. That's kind of that type of validation there. You know, do you need a date? Do you need a time? Which part do you need? Maybe you just need a time or maybe you just need a date. So just making sure that the validation is really proper on your different fields, especially for reusability and using this content in different sources like displays, TV displays, apps, these systems that obviously take those things and maybe use them as more of an editable or interactive part, even a date. Maybe a system doesn't want that as text, it wants it more date format. So it can reconvert that to a shorter form or a longer form, depending on where that date is being used. So this one's really critical. And you know, there's regex and other type of ways to really convert, verify those things and validation with different systems. And the last big one I have here is using custom fields where complex validation is necessary. So a lot of people think about validation on a field per field basis. So this text field, this rich text area, this image, I got to add my validation. But what happens if you need 3 fields to all be required, or sorry, if 2 fields to be required, if another one is there, or you know, this cross relationships, or if I pick in a drop down, I need 3 categories, and then I have to relate to 3 categories. You can't do that with simple validation on one field. You have to do it across fields, maybe even across external systems. Like if I'm adding a related product to a product database somewhere else, you know, does that product still exist, or is that product published? Is it ready to go live? Custom fields can be used for this. As I said, to some systems like Agility have on save, on publish events that you can tap into and add in, you know, custom validation layers into there. But I think this is really important when you really get into complex modeling, where you have a lot of relationships, have a lot of other external systems, or a lot of fields that are dependent on things. I know, Joel, we've done some really cool things where you have your top general content fields, then you have a drop down of saying like, this is a video blog post, a text blog post, or something else. And by changing that drop down, you actually get different fields visible or hidden as well. So you're hiding and showing that different fields to make it easier for the user to ignore fields that don't matter if they picked another thing. So that's not really necessarily validation, but it's more usability, you know, cleaning.
Yeah, and Ella wrote in the comments, you know, is it just if this then that, you know, kind of like logic that you do there, and the answer to that one is it's whatever you define it to be. So, you know, the idea is you decide what the validation needs to be on this item, and then find a way to make that work inside the content platform. And if it's not an out of the box kind of feature, then something like a custom field or a custom event that you implement can take care of that.
100%. And then the next thing here, Joel, Now you have to ensure your developers build with all your validation in mind as well. So I think there's a major disconnect often here between the content architect or the editor who's kind of building these components and these models, and then the developer, and communicating and what are the validation rules. So for example, if a value is blank, how does that change what the developer is building? I see all the time errors on sites when they first go out. The developer gets a content model, maps the fields out to some design or something, and then they'll add a new blog post or a new piece of content, and it's missing a field. They didn't type it in, they didn't select it or whatever, and the site errors, right? Because it's looking for a value and it gets a null or an empty value back. So it's really important for your API calls to pull the data, but assume that data will be blank or will change over time. They should always assume it's just going to change, because every time, even a validation could change over time looking at the content model. So build with that in mind and talk to the developers being like, you know what, I'm always going to give you this value because this content makes no sense, or assume it could be blank or whatnot. But I kind of always recommend to developers, assume you'll get back maybe nothing. What happens, I know another thing, what if the list has no items in it? You schedule all the content, blog posts, and you get no items in the list, but the developers asked for a list of blog posts and maps it, assuming there's a minimum one blog post. These are things that people don't test often because they'll populate the content with some dummy information and see what it looks like, and then it never gets to the point where there's no items in the list. But that's very common especially for linked content. We have categories or tags or things like that where you're changing content or unpublishing things over time.
Yeah, that's a big one, John. That content might be published at some point, but then an editor might come along later, or someone who's managing a site, and then unpublish things that they're not sure where they were needed. And then if you didn't handle that null state or that empty list state, that can create some issues. So the big one, I think, is handle blank or null values and empty lists as much as possible.
Yeah.